Well, good morning. Good morning. Well, some of you are awake. I'd like to read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. William Wilberforce was the happy victim of his own success, writes his biographer, or one of his biographers, in a book entitled Amazing Grace. And by the way, the movie is worth watching. Has anybody seen the movie Amazing Grace? Nope. Well, that's your homework. Go find it. It's somewhere out there. Amazing Grace, starring, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Ian Griffith, you know, the Welsh actor, Hornblower, Fantastic Four, Blank Looks.
They got better things to do at the time than watch.
Black Hawk Down. He was in it for 5 seconds. All right, well, William Wilberforce was the happy victim of his own success. He was like someone who, against all odds, finds the cure for a horrible disease that's ravaging the world, and the cure is so overwhelmingly successful, it vanquishes the disease completely. No one suffers from it again, and within a generation or two, no one remembers it ever existed. So, how many of you know who William Wilberforce, how many of you know who he was? Okay, that's about what I expected. Well, who was he and what did he cure? Well, over 2 centuries ago in 1807, the extraordinarily persistent British backbencher secured the passage by Parliament of an act for the abolition of the slave trade throughout His Majesty's realms and territories. Wilberforce and a small band of fellow Christians, which included the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and the former slave trader, John Newton, who wrote, anybody? Thank you. Who wrote the hymn the words to Amazing Grace, had been praying and debating and lobbying for that day for 20 years. Now, it would be a further 26 years before slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire, shortly before his death in 1833. Now, the institution of slavery unfortunately predates the origin of the word in English itself. Slave comes from Slav, Eastern Europeans, brought into bondage to the glittering metropolis of Rome. It predates by millennia the earliest laws, such as the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia. The first legally recognized slave in the American colonies was, in a horrible irony, owned by a black man who had himself arrived as an indentured servant. The first slave owners in North America were not, in fact, white Europeans, but tribes of Native Americans who took their enemies as slaves. As the biographer puts it, slavery was as accepted as birth and marriage and death, so woven into the tapestry of human history that you could barely see the threads, much less pull them out. Everywhere on the globe, for 5,000 years, the idea of human civilization without slavery was simply unimaginable. 200 years ago, the passage of that act changed not only the British Empire and its territories, but the world. What Wilberforce vanquished was something even worse than slavery, his biographer says, something that was much more fundamental and can hardly be seen from where we stand today. He vanquished the very mindset that made slavery acceptable and allowed it to survive and thrive for millennia. He destroyed an entire way of seeing the world, one that had held sway since the beginning of history, and replaced it with another way of seeing the world. Now, unfortunately, slavery still exists in pockets and places in Africa, for instance. But I've often heard the lament among Christians, what can we do? We have no influence. We don't really have any power. How can we change the world? Well, for proof of that, just look around you. Just open your news app in your phone. Just turn on the news in the morning. I was going to say pick up a newspaper. Okay, if they still exist. It doesn't take long for you to see terrible things. War throughout the world, all over, and rumor of war, to quote a phrase. There's just so many terrible things happening. So much woe, so much sorrow, so much conflict. What do we do about it? What can we do? What influence do we Christians have? Well, little or none is the answer, secretly whispered, if not openly spoken. And yet, we have Wilberforce as an example of one who did not simply amend a trade system, but in the words of the word that his biographer used, murdered it. The old acceptance of slavery in wider society simply ceased. As he wrote in Wilberforce that is, as he wrote in 1787, at the beginning of his Odyssey, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Now, Wilberforce wasn't speaking about persuading gentlemen from burping in polite company or encouraging ladies to act demurely rather than like Paris Hilton on a bender. Is Paris Hilton still a thing? I don't know. Or preventing the little charming tots of high society from wiping their nose on their satin frock coats. That's not what he meant about manners. What he meant by the reformation of manners was the changing of culture. And the culture needed changing. Whether or not you enjoy spending your evening watching documentaries, and I don't know why you wouldn't, I think, well, apparently you don't. Well, watch documentaries. How else are you going to learn stuff? I think you'll be surprised by the kind of culture in which Wilberforce and his fellow abolitionists lived, and by how familiar it seems. The 18th century Church of England preached, in someone's words, a tepid kind of moralism. And I'm not criticizing the Anglicans, okay? I'm just quoting someone here. Disconnected from both serious faith and the great questions facing the nation. The culture itself was hedonistic, amusing itself to death. Wilberforce goes to a performance of the opera Don Juan and is shocked by a provocative dance, and then is even further shocked to discover the rest of the audience is not shocked. Too blasé even to be interested. The Paris Hilton of the age, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was celebrated for having had 7,000 sexual partners and snipped from each a keepsake hair. 25% of all unmarried females in London alone were prostitutes. Average age was 16. Many brothels prided themselves on offering only girls under 14. And again, in London, the number of gin shops and taverns outnumbered churches many times over. Sounds like Cold Lake. A child as young as 7 or 8 could buy a glass of gin for a penny, and many bought bottles to take home for their parents, good little tots. Wilberforce and his fellow Christians helped change that. through the slow, tedious forum of Parliament, of course, the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself, child labor laws, prison reform, welfare. But Wilberforce saw changing the laws as simply one avenue for change. He was just as, if not more, interested in changing the culture, the reformation of manners, as he put it. Well, one can certainly change a law, but not change the mindset of people. Hence, why prohibition failed in the United States. Much more effective than changing a statute is to change minds and hearts of those who live in society. And then the transformation of law becomes almost an afterthought. Change the hearts of people and the will follow. But of course, that is a much, much more arduous task, changing mindsets and values and beliefs rather than simply enacting a new law that people will probably ignore. What Wilberforce did was quite simply to follow one of Jesus Christ's most subtle, finally he's getting back to the Bible. What do you know? One of his most subtle yet transforming teachings, what I read this morning, being salt and light in the world. Now that is a teaching of gradual, almost imperceptible change, but more powerful than most realize. And the words of Christ have become so familiar to us that it's possible that as I read them this morning, you could anticipate probably what the next words were. But their transformative power then has almost been leached away by their very familiarity. We no longer recognize just how subversive and how potent his teaching is. He used two common images to illustrate the influence which he expected his disciples, us, to have upon the world. In a pitch black room, it does not take a very powerful light at all to make a difference. And that's good, because most of us are around the 10 watt or 15 watt power, to be honest, And it's amazing, if you're a cook, just what a pinch of salt can do to the flavor of a dish. Jesus began his mission with 12 men. And when he returned to the Father, he left perhaps a few dozen men and women to carry on this transformative work. In the darkness of this world where people wander blindly, thanks, Chris, for that this morning, Jesus calls us to light the way. In a world where people's appetites have been dulled by a constant diet of excess, Jesus calls us to flavor our society with the gospel and grace. It is possible to change a culture. It is possible to transform a nation. Wilberforce, in concert with Christians across Britain, prayed and worked for decades. And 200 years ago, they saw the fruit of their labor. But they did not end there. They continue to act as light in a dark place, revealing slavery as a cruel, foul system in which one human being profited from the misery of another. They changed enough people's minds and views that not only the trade, but the very institution itself was abolished. And they didn't even end there. If we think of Victorian society, and we often do, very stereotypically, the Victorians, very, very moralistic and prudish. Well, it's because of Wilberforce and his colleagues who changed the culture. In the 1790s, as I said, a good man could walk past a young prostitute on the streets of London without feeling a twinge of disgust or outrage or that why should this exist? He accepted her merely as a feature of the landscape. By the 1890s, yes, child prostitutes still existed, but there were charities and there were orphanages. It was no longer accepted as the way life was. It just is. That's the way life is. It was no longer accepted that way, but that it was a blight and a rot in the body politic. And it was Christians like Wilberforce acting as light and salt which changed English society and Western society. Tom Sines' book, The Mustard Seed Conspiracy, is subtitled, "You Can Make a Difference in Tomorrow's Troubled World." And he writes, Jesus let us in on an astonishing secret. God has chosen to change the world through the lowly and the unassuming and the imperceptible. That has always been God's strategy, changing the world through the conspiracy of the insignificant. He chose a ragged bunch of Semite slaves to become the insurgents of his new order. And who would have ever dreamed God would choose to work through a baby in a cow stall to turn the world right side up? God chose the foolish things, the weak things, the lowly things, the things that are not, Paul wrote. It is still God's policy to work through the embarrassingly insignificant to change the world and create his future. Now, I think that is a beautifully apt description, the embarrassingly insignificant, to describe Wilberforce, who, at under 5 feet tall, was quite short even for his time. James Boswell, the acerbically witted contemporary, described Wilberforce as the shrimp that grew and grew and became a whale. Ragged Semite slaves, common as dirt disciples, a shrimp that became a whale, a few 15-watt bulbs, and a sprinkling of salt. Such are those whom God uses to change the world. Amen.